The Falcons diversifying their run game could pay huge dividends for their offense in 2025.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Now, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Been going strong on this Locked On Falcons podcast for almost 9 years. And I appreciate each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers of this humble podcast. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we are continuing our positional breakdowns of the Falcons offensive line, talking about competitions for backup spots, talk about the expected growth from 2 of the Falcons' 5 starters, right? And I know some of you guys are like, Aaron, you're going to talk about, quarterback on Netflix. As I told you guys at the end of yesterday's episode, I'm probably going to wait till tomorrow. I haven't quite watched it as I'm sitting here recording. Haven't started the thing, but at least the early returns, want to give everybody some time. Not everybody's binging on the same schedule. Some people have to work for a living. They can't stay at home and watch Netflix. What a crazy concept. But, some of the early returns on the sort of what I've been hearing from other people who have watched, that and talked about with Kirk Cousins, it does seem to be suggesting that, Kirk indicates that he probably wouldn't have signed with the Falcons had they been a little bit more forthcoming with their plans to draft Michael Penix. And, I've heard from various folks being very critical of Kirk. It's like, well, you got paid all this money and, take it like a man sort of situation. But I personally empathize with Kirk on that front. We'll see, how much I do after watching the show. But, basically my perspective is, if the Falcons had been a little bit more forthcoming with Kirk, they probably wouldn't have had to spend all that money on Kirk Cousins, and they would have saved themselves a lot of headaches over the last calendar year. So to me, I don't think Kirk's in the wrong in having that sort of opinion, but we will leave that probably for tomorrow's episode and later this week with Jarvis Davis. Instead, we're going to talk offensive line, run game, pass protection, all that stuff. But before we get into all of that, guys, we got to talk about Zach Robinson, right? And today we're going to be more positive about Zach Robinson and diversity for this Falcons run game. And I know you guys are like, Aaron, you're so bipolar. One day you're criticizing Zach Robinson, one day you're praising him, all this stuff. And it's like, hey guys, there's a thing that people on the internet struggle with, which is nuance, and so we got to deal with that. But DEI, right? Very controversial subject when it comes to other avenues, but it's very good thing when it comes to NFL and offensive football. Basically, because you've heard me say this many times, and I've yet to find an exception. Maybe one day we will. But in football, being good at multiple things is better than being good at one thing. And I'll illustrate this with a baseball analogy. Basically, the idea is you have one really outstanding pitch, which is a fastball. In the Falcons' case, when it comes to their run game, is the outside zone run scheme. And, we're not saying, hey, don't throw fastballs anymore, especially if you're throwing a nigh unhittable fastball, which the Falcons, being very efficient, predominantly spamming outside zone, you could argue was, right, throwing 106 miles per hour. If you can throw that fast, then keep throwing that. But the problem comes when you stop throwing 106, which could come due to injuries, right? In the Falcons' case, their backup offensive linemen aren't as good executing outside zone as their starters. What happens if Charlie Warner gets injured, as we've discussed in the past? In order to execute a high-level outside zone scheme, you need that good perimeter blocking. The Falcons do not have a blocking tight end on par with Charlie Warner. So if he misses games, all of a sudden your ability to throw 106 in this analogy, now all of a sudden you're throwing 96, and that becomes a lot more hittable for a pro batter, or in this case, for a pro-style NFL defense to stop when it comes to the run game. And we know it's likely that you're going to see your backups play, right? I've tracked the Falcons offensive line for 3 decades now, and they've had 3 seasons over the last 30 years where all 5 of their starters started every game. So you have a 90% chance that there will be at least one injury this upcoming season. And over the course of that 30-year period, when tracking, the A lineup, right, that lineup that starts week 1, how often do those guys start? On average, over 30 years, it's about 7 games. Now, over the past decade, that increases on average to about 10 starts together for that A lineup. And over the past 4 years specifically, with Terry Fontenot and Dwayne Ledford being here, that's about 11 and a half starts, but on average. But that basically means the odds are high that, we're going to get at least a month of the season where the Falcons are going to be dealing with backups, and their run scheme is probably not going to be nearly as good. They're not going to be able to throw 106 miles per hour, and your best pitch is not going to be good enough if that's your only pitch. And so you need to have other pitches in your arsenal, and that's where diversifying the run scheme adds value. It helps not only with the run game, but also with your play action passing game. As we've discussed last year, the Falcons were overly reliant on an outside zone scheme, and I think that hurt their play action passing game, which is one of the reasons why it was not very effective on the rare occasions when the Falcons were able to use that, because they run so much of the stretch play, which is the bread and butter play of the outside zone. And the play action concept you love to build off of that stretch play is the bootleg. But with Kirk's limited mobility, it was less effective. And so when the Falcons did run play action plays, it didn't look like their run scheme, right? Defenses weren't confused when they were running play action concepts for run plays that they weren't necessarily running. Now, Penix is going to help in that regard by adding more mobility to position, but I don't think Michael Penix is the guy that you sit there and go like with a Michael Vick or a Marcus Mariota or Lamar Jackson, you say, oh man, he's going to be super dynamic on these bootlegs or anything like that. And so if the Falcons continue to spam that in the outside zone, and you're going to trust in Michael Penix's ability to beat Dallas Turner and Hassan Reddick and all these athletic NFL edge rushers one-on-one on the edge, as harsh as it's going to sound, like in that scenario, Kirk Cousins is probably going to be starting by week 6 if the Falcons plan on doing that. So diversifying your run scheme and marrying that run scheme to your play action passing game was a issue for the Falcons last year, but hopefully it's going to be less of an issue this year because the Falcons are moving in the right direction, and we'll be able to add different things that will keep defenses on their toes. And I think there's reasons for optimism when it comes to that, because we did see more diversity late in the season. I didn't chart the season fully. I charted the first 5 games of the season and most of the last 5 or 5 out of the last 6 games of the season. I didn't chart the Minnesota game. I didn't chart the second half against the Raiders and the fourth quarter against the Giants. But basically, I charted about 105 rush plays in the first 5 games and 135 in those final 5-ish games. And so that roughly works out to be about half of the team's run plays from 2024. So I think a healthy sample size to draw conclusions based off of my own charter. And we know that the Falcons majored in outside zone. In the first 5 games, they ran it about 66% of the time. In those final 5 games, it was about 44% of the time. Now they added the mid-zone run concepts in those final 5 games. I didn't chart any mid-zone runs in the first 5 games, but the final 5 games was about 8% mid-zone. And it's likely early in the season when I wasn't distinguishing between them, that some of those outside zone runs were actually mid-zone runs. But that 66% probably includes some mid-zone. But even if we say that that was the case, 66% versus the combined 52% mid-zone and outside zone over the last 5 games shows you that the Falcons were less reliant on the outside zone as the season wore on. They dialed up more inside zone and duo late in the season. Again, inside zone and duo are hard to kind of distinguish. But in the first 5 games combined, that was about 17% of their run plays. In the final 5, that was about 34%. So they doubled their amount of inside zone / duo. They ran more split zone early in the season, about 11% in the first 5 games versus 7%. So we did see a decrease there, but you kind of offset that by running more gap runs than the zone runs, right? You saw wham and crunch in those last couple of games, about 2% of their runs versus 0% in the first 5 games of the season. And so, as I said earlier, the goal is not to scrap the outside zone. It's still by far your best pitch, but instead of spamming it 50, 60% of the time or more, as we've seen this team do, I think a healthier rate would be maybe 35 to 40%. And if you decrease your outside zone by 15 to 20% on average per game, that's going to be basically 4 to 6 plays where you're going to run something other than outside zone. That 15 to 20% works out to be about 4 to 6 plays. And so if you can get a handful of times where you can get defenses to, keep them on their toes because you're giving them a different look, I think that is going to be beneficial for your Falcons offense. And given the athleticism that works so well in the outside zone, again, I think you can incorporate more run concepts that involve pulling and trap blocks that take advantage of that athleticism still. Lindstrom was very good pulling when he was at Boston College from my film study many, many years ago. And going back and looking at my notes from Matthew Bergeron at Syracuse, while he wasn't, I don't think, as good as Lindstrom was, but he was good enough that I think that is still something that you can incorporate a handful of times with him pulling and trapping and all that. So it's all that to say is, I think the Falcons are moving in the right direction when it comes to, diversity, equity, and inclusion when it comes to their run scheme based off of the trend that they showed over the course of last year. But the question is, with all that diversity coming in after the bye week, was that in part due to Drew Dahlman's return, or was that just a natural evolution, which is going to be a critical question this upcoming season because Drew Dahlman is now gone? And are you going to be as willing to do that with Ryan Nusel taking over at the starting center? And we'll talk about what his presence in the starting lineup means, as well as whether or not we're going to get a big year 3 jump from Matthew Bergeron as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're looking to check out baseball under the lights, hit that golf ball on the green, or some high stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. And you're already following all this action, so why not make it a little bit more thrilling with FanDuel? And whether you're looking to see the Braves bounce back before the All-Star break, or maybe you're starting to get very excited about the moves that the Hawks are making for this upcoming season, or you're already excited about all the moves the Falcons have made this offseason, FanDuel is going to give you so many opportunities, not only to bet on when Ronald Acuna hits his next home run, whether the Hawks are going to make a Eastern Conference run, or if the Falcons could, dare I say, make a Super Bowl run. It's easy to use FanDuel. It's fast to pay out, so why wait? By going over to FanDuel and sign up now. And if you're new customers can bet just $5. And if it wins, you get $150 in bonus bets. Again, just bet $5. And if it wins, you get $150 in bonus bets by just opening up the FanDuel app today or visiting FanDuel.com to get started. So the question is, when we talk about the Falcons starting offensive line, we know 3 of these 5 starters are pretty much known commodities. Jake Matthews, very good pass protector, a little underwhelming as a run blocker. Chris Lindstrom, a good pass protector and an elite outside zone run blocker, which is a big reason why the Falcons will continue to maintain, outside zone as their best pitch, as long as Chris Lindstrom is here for the foreseeable future. Caleb McGarry, a very good run blocker and a middling pass protector, right? Kind of the opposite of Jake Matthews. And I know there's going to be a lot more concern about McGarry now that he's responsible for protecting the blind side of the left-handed quarterback in Michael Penix. I think that is a worthwhile concern. I'm not going to be super worried about it and losing sleep about it. And I think, having tight ends that are going to chip, which goes back to the conversation we had yesterday about Kyle Pitts and his role in the offense. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not super optimistic that, the tight end's role is going to be super drastically different this year. Given the need to have that guy help out Caleb McGarry and prevent that guy from being on an island. But, again, it's just the idea of in addition to Pitts doing all that stuff, can you get him more involved for, 3 to 5 plays a game, which to me is not a huge mountain that this team can climb. But, that's another reason why, the play action passing game, because that's going to help benefit McGarry, because that's not going to put as much stress on him in pass protection, because he can move forward instead of moving backwards on that particular play. So again, that's another reason why you can get Kyle Pitts involved in the play action. Go back and listen to yesterday's episode to get more insight on that. But we kind of know what these 3 guys are. The only question is, will they stay healthy and will they maintain what they have been for a number of years? When it comes to the other 2 starters, we don't quite know what they're going to be. That's left guard Matthew Bergeron and center Ryan Nusel. And with Bergeron, he showed significant growth in pass protection this year, to the point that it's not a major concern for me. Basically, he held his own against Chris Jones. And since then, I've not been super concerned with Matthew Bergeron. Again, there are going to be some tough matchups for him this year against guys like Quinnen Williams and Derek Brown and Leonard Williams and Vita Vea and DeForest Buckner, et cetera. And those guys are going to give him and Lindstrom and the other interior guys problems, but I'm not losing too much sleep over those matchups being, a disaster like I was worried about this time last year. But the big question with Bergeron is going to be his run blocking. And this is where I've been most critical of Bergeron over the last 2 years, because he hasn't quite lived up to expectations. It was the idea, those expectations being he would be, kind of the McGarry on the left side of the offensive line, that plus run blocker that can kind of balance out Jake Matthews' deficiencies there. He hasn't really quite been that. And mostly because in the outside zone scheme where you need your guard to really hit those reach blocks and second level blocks, he hasn't been as consistent as we would like to be. I think there was growth for him last year, particularly in the latter part, just going back and watching a little bit of the film before today's episode, but I want to see a bigger jump for him in that regard. Or basically, I would say maybe he's a 5 or 6 out of 10 run blocker. Can we get him to a 7 or 8 out of 10 run blocker in that regard? And I know some people say, oh, well, Aaron, you got to factor in the transition from tackle to guard. And I think that's a huge part of his transition in pass protection. But I don't think it's as big a factor when it comes to run blocking. In my opinion, playing tackle or guard doesn't significantly impact your ability to move a defender off the ball or make a reach block or a second level block. You either hit it or you don't, whether you're playing tackle or guard. And so hopefully we'll see Bergeron hit that. I'm optimistic that he will show growth. I'm just in wait and see mode to see how much growth, how big a jump he's going to make. I know PFF did a study several years ago that offensive linemen, for the most part, make their biggest jumps in years 3 or 4 in the NFL. We've seen that trend with guys like Lindstrom, McGarry, and Drew Dalman in the past. And so I expect I expect Bergeron to make a similar jump this year. It's just, again, a question of how big a jump he's going to make. Now, when it comes to Ryan Nuzul, obviously he's one of the 5 starters that's technically new to the lineup and has the most question marks. We've seen him fill in as a serviceable fill-in injury replacement in the last 2 years, starting 12 games, 11 games over the last 2 seasons combined. But can he be a formidable 17-game starter? I expect there to be some drop-off from Drew Dalman to him. It's just a question of how much drop-off. And I'm sure you've heard other people say this, and I generally agree with this. I don't think there's a big drop-off. There's much of a gap between Dalman and Nuzul when it comes to pass protection, but there is one, in my opinion, significant one when it comes to run blocking, at least based off of last season. And that was reflected that in the 9 games that Nuzul started, the Falcons really struggled in short yardage situations, but also they struggled against the better competition. The playoff caliber defenses, their rushing efficiency dropped off a cliff during those 9 games that Nuzul was playing. And that tells me that Nuzul at this stage, based off of his performance last year, is much more of a high caliber backup than a true quality starter at this stage. And, essentially a quality starter is a guy that it doesn't really matter the level of competition. He's going to be able to rise to meet it. And a quality backup is a guy that's going to, thrive against lower level competition, but against the higher caliber competition is going to struggle to meet it. And that's basically, to me, what Nuzul was last year, unlike Dalman. And so we wonder if Nuzul can make the growth to close that gap and be more than a high caliber backup and be a quality starter for this team. And I think there's certainly the possibility that there is untapped potential, but he's going into his 5th year. And again, you could argue based off of, again, that year 3, year 4 jump that we've already sort of tapped out with Nuzul. We've already seen him make the jump. Is there another jump in him? We'll see. That will be an open question. And it's harder to be as optimistic about that as we are with Bergeron, who is a younger player. But, I think if you're the team that, despite all your rushing success, you're going to be the team, as the Falcons were at times last year, when Nuzul was a starter, a team that struggles to get a yard when you need a yard, that's obviously going to have limitations on how good this offense can be, particularly in the red zone, which is going to put more pressure on the quarterback to do a lot of the heavy lifting in that situation. And the goal should be to take pressure off of Michael Penix rather than putting pressure on him. And that's where you need your short yardage run game to be successful, as we saw with a young Matt Ryan, who could very much rely on, putting the ball in the belly of Michael Turner and letting him run behind blocks of Ovi Maheli and Harvey Dahl and Tyson Clabo in his first year as a NFL player, and led to a very successful first year as an NFL player. So I think if we can get Nuzul and Bergeron to go from 5 out of 10 run blockers to 7 out of 10 run blockers at the very least, and you couple that with the 9 out of 10 that McGarry and Lindstrom are, or arguably 10 out of 10 when they're on their best days, that's going to really put you ahead of the curve as far as your run game is concerned. But if they remain, 5s or 6s, that's going to lead to, that doesn't mean that your offensive line is going to suck or anything like that, but it's going to be much closer to the middle of the pack when it comes to your offensive line than the top 5 to 10 unit that I think most people love to say that the Falcons offensive line is, and certainly has the potential to be when they're, on their game and whatnot. So now that we've broken down what's at stake for the Falcons 5 starters, let's talk about the ongoing competitions for who are going to be those backups as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So it's very likely that the Falcons are going to keep 9 offensive linemen on their 53-man roster this year. Last year, they carried 11 for most of the season. About 9 games, they had 11 guys on their roster. There were 7 games where they had 10 guys. So they only kept 9 for that week 1 game was the only game where they only had 9 guys on their from the offensive line on their 53-man roster. And I mostly bring that up not only to point out the possibility that they could keep more than 9, but also because it's just another way for me to gripe about the Atlanta Falcons and their terrible roster management last year, because despite carrying all those offensive linemen, they still let Matt Hennessy get swiped by the 49ers late in the season so that they could keep guys like Brandon Parker and Kyle Hinton. And I bring that up just because I think we would all feel a lot better about the situation at center if we were entering training camp with Hennessy and Nuzul competing for that spot, as opposed to having Nuzul as the uncontested starter with no proven backup option. So if I do sound like I'm biased against guys like Brandon Parker and Kyle Hinton, that kind of explains it. And it's not really those players' fault that the Falcons let Matt Hennessy. That's a 100% on Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot for not having the foresight 2 weeks before the end of the season to find a way to keep Matt Hennessy on the roster so that they could avoid a situation where Drew Dalman walked this free agent. But I digress. So, if we expect 9 on the roster, the safe bet is that 4 of those will be offensive tackles and 5 of those will be interior players. We know 3 of the 4 offensive tackles are going to be Jake Matthews, Caleb McGarry, and most likely Storm Norton. Unless he falls off a cliff this summer at age 31, he's a safe bet to be that swing tackle and third tackle. But there will be a competition for that 4th spot between Brandon Parker and Jack Nelson. Parker will turn 30 in October. So I think given Nelson's youth, given his draft status, even as a lowly 7th round pick, he should have an edge in any sort of competition. So if it's close, it'll go to Jack Nelson. The question is, will it be close? And we mentioned this last month when I did my Jack Nelson comprehensive scouting report. I expect Jack Nelson to be up and down in his first summer, as we've seen a number of Falcons offensive linemen as they enter the NFL and whatnot. But the hope is that you see enough ups, enough flashes of good play from Jack Nelson in training camp, in the preseason, that is going to merit saying, okay, this guy's worth a roster spot. I think Nelson has the advantage when it comes to that stuff, but he's still going to have to perform. And we know that Dwayne Ledford, the Falcons offensive line coach, loves him some Brandon Parker, given that he tried to recruit Brandon Parker to NC State basically a decade ago. We saw Parker struggle for 5 years with the Raiders. But we'll see if, he's shown some development over the past year, given, similar to what we saw with Storm Norton, now that he's gotten with Dwayne Ledford. Storm Norton similarly struggled early in his career with the Chargers, but has gotten much better since getting coached by Ledford and joining the Falcons in 2023. Now on the interior, we know the 3 starters are going to be 5 of the guys you keep in Lindstrom, Nuzul, and Bergeron. I think the 2 likeliest options to be your backups are going to be Kyle Hinton at guard and Javon Gwynn at center. But there will be competition here. Elijah Wilkinson, who's got a lot more starting experience than Kyle Hinton, but is on the older side. I have a little bit more faith in Elijah Wilkinson just because I got to see him be a functional starter for you for half of the 2022 season than I have in Kyle Hinton, but we'll see. And, the good thing that Wilkinson does give you is he does have some tackle flexibility. He's, in my opinion, a much better guard than a tackle. But in a world where, both Nelson and Parker disappoint at tackle this year, Wilkinson does add that added depth that could be valuable for this football team. And you also have undrafted free agent at Oregon State, Joshua Gray, who's one of the, 4 or 5, quote unquote, prize 8th round options for the Falcons in the undrafted free agency, has developmental upside potentially as a center, but predominantly was a tackle and guard in college. And so I think we'll see a lot of him, particularly at guard this summer. And it's not to write off any of the other options like Killian Zier or Matthew Cindric or Mike Gonzalez on the interior, or backup offensive tackles like Tyrone Wheatley Jr. and Jordan Williams. It's not certainly impossible for those guys to make a bid for the roster, but I think all of those guys have uphill battles to make the Falcons roster. And we'll sort of see, how it all shapes out in training camp. We've seen over the last couple of summers where the Falcons have been active on the waiver wire after camp to add offensive linemen. There's been 4 straight years where the Falcons have scooped up a veteran offensive lineman in the month of September. 3 of those years, that player that they scooped up went on to start at least a game for them. Kobe Gossett in 2021, Chuma Edoga in 2022, and Storm Norton in 2023. Brandon Parker was that guy that they scooped up last year but didn't play. And we'll see if Dwayne Ledford's developmental capabilities will end that streak, or we'll see that streak continue for 5 years of the Falcons needing to scoop up guys. And again, as I said, I'm not the world's biggest fan of Kyle Hinton, but I do certainly think when he got opportunities to play last year, he was better than he was the previous year. And Javon Gwynn hasn't done much in the 2 years since the Falcons made him a 7th round pick. But again, the year 3 jump does potentially apply to him as well. So we'll see if he makes that jump. So, going back to the top of the show, I don't have a ton of confidence sitting here today that if any of these backups that we're talking about have to be played due to injuries, that we'll still be able to throw the heat that we want to throw when it comes to the run game. But, that conversation could be very different 2 months from now as we get to see more of these guys in training camp. So we will see what's what on the Falcons offensive line. We will see what's what on Kirk Cousins in the quarterback documentary. Although, for all I know, I might watch the show and be like, let's talk about Jared Goff and Joe Burrow. Their storylines are far more entertaining than Kirk Cousins. So that's all potentially in store for you tomorrow on today's on tomorrow's Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Hawks if you want to get insight into what the big moves the Hawks are making so that they can make that potential Eastern Conference playoff run. I haven't checked FanDuel in a couple of days to see what their odds are of winning the Eastern Conference, but last I checked, they were like 4th best odds. So, we're tired of the play-in game. It's all Hawks are all in. So Brad Rowland will have it covered on that front. And of course, if you're, haven't got enough football content, check out Locked On NFL Scouting with Joe Marino. Kyle Krabs going to make you the most informed fans you can be all summer long as we gear up for this upcoming season in training camp. So check out those shows. They're all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.